Good afternoon, everybody. We're just giving the system a few more seconds to let the journalists in before we begin the program. All right, good afternoon from Nairobi, everyone, and welcome to this media briefing, during which we will launch the 8th edition of the UN Environment Programme's Adaptation Gap Report. My name is Keisha Rukikaire. I'm the head of news and media for UNEP, and I'll be moderating this event. UNEP's Adaptation Gap Report series provides an annual science-based assessment of the global progress on adaptation, planning, financing, and implementation. It also explores options for enhancing and advancing national and global options for adaptation efforts and provides in-depth analysis of selected issues of interest. This year's report, Underfinanced, Underprepared, Inadequate Investment and Planning on Climate Adaptation Leaves the World Exposed, provides a more thorough assessment and revised estimates of adaptation finance gaps, and also takes a deep dive into loss and damage. Now, before we get into the substance of the press conference, I just go over a few housekeeping rules. Our program is 45 minutes long, and we hope to use about half that time for questions. We will start with a presentation of the report's main findings by Mr. Henry Neufeld, who is the Chief Scientific Editor of the AGR, the Adaptation Gap Report, followed by brief remarks by our panel, which will then lead into the media Q&A. Our panelists are in various parts of the world with varying internet strengths, so do bear with us if we should encounter any technical challenges. We will do our best to get those fixed immediately. So on our panel today, we have Ms. Inge Anderson, who is the Executive Director of UNEP, the UNEP Environment Programme. We have Mr. Ibrahim Tiao, who is the Executive Secretary of the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. And we have Ms. Loretta Hiba Girardet, who is Chief of Risk Knowledge, Monitoring and Capacity Development for the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Also on hand to respond to questions are Dr. Andrea Hinwood, who is UNEP's Chief Scientist, and Paul Watkis, who authored the report's finance chapter. For media colleagues with questions, you will see a Q&A option on your screen. Please submit your questions in writing in this box, and you can start to submit them right away, as I know many of you will have received the report under embargo. When you submit your question, please specify your name and the media outlet you represent. The session is being recorded and live streamed, and the live stream can be accessed through our website and our YouTube channel. Our contact information is available, and please get in touch should you have questions. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Henry Neufeld, who is the Chief Scientific Editor of the report, for the presentation of its main findings. Over to you, Henry.
Thank you, Keisha. I'll start sharing my screen now. Let me know if you can't see it. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present the key findings of the Adaptation Gap Report 2023, Underfinanced, Underprepared. In the context of growing climate risks, the Adaptation Gap Reports provide science-based assessments of the global progress in adaptation to inform international climate change discussions under the UNFCCC. For this report, UNEP convened 54 authors, of which 45% are in the developing world and over half are female. The production of the report was overseen by an international steering committee, and it has benefited from 2 rounds of external expert reviews. Besides describing progress in adaptation planning and implementation, this year's report has undertaken a major adaptation finance update and focuses on loss and damage. This year saw the hottest summer on record globally by a large margin, unprecedented flooding in China, extreme heat and wildfires in Canada and the US, and the continuation of a multi-year drought in East Africa, among others. Evidence is clear that climate impacts are rising and are increasingly translating into limits to adaptation, some of which may have already been reached. To protect vulnerable populations and avoid increasing losses and damages, we must urgently ramp up adaptation efforts alongside rapid cuts to greenhouse gas emissions. The Adaptation Gap Report 2023 shows why adaptation is slowing on all fronts when it should be accelerating to catch up with climate impacts. As the upper figure shows, progress in adaptation planning is plateauing. While 5 out of 6 countries now have at least one national adaptation planning instrument, progress to reach full global coverage is slowing and requires greater support. On the other hand, over half of countries have 2 or more national level instruments, and their quality is improving in terms of adequacy and effectiveness. The lower figure shows that while projects are getting bigger, the number of adaptation actions supported through the 4 international climate funds has stagnated for the past decade. The report also found that gender and social inclusion is poorly addressed and funded in adaptation actions despite showing better results. The Adaptation Gap Report 2023 carried out a major adaptation finance update based on a comprehensive assessment of the literature and new analyses. Kindly refer to the in-depth chapter and online background report for details. The figure shows that modeled adaptation costs in this decade are $215 billion per year. Adaptation costs are expected to rise significantly by 2050. Adaptation finance needed to implement domestic adaptation priorities is estimated at $318 billion per year until 2030. In contrast, international public adaptation finance flows to developing countries declined by 15% from 2020 levels to $21 billion in 2021. As a result of growing needs, and faltering flows, the current adaptation finance gap is now estimated to be in the range of $194 to $366 billion per year. Adaptation finance needs are thus 10 to 18 times as great as international public finance flows, much higher than previously estimated. Doubling of 2019 adaptation finance flows by 2025 to about $40 billion per year, as urged in the Glasgow Climate Pact, is therefore more urgent than ever. But on its own, even that can only narrow the adaptation finance gap by 5 to 10%. Effective adaptation significantly reduces climate risks and is good value for money. For example, studies indicate that every billion invested in adaptation against coastal flooding leads to 14 billion in reduced economic damages. And $16 billion invested in agricultural adaptation every year can prevent around 78 million people from starvation or chronic hunger because of climate change impacts. But finding innovative ways to enhance finance for adaptation is essential to narrow the gap. As the figure shows, this report identifies 7 ways to increase adaptation finance. Scaling up international public finance, domestic expenditures, and private sector finance remain central to enhancing adaptation action. 4 additional potential sources of adaptation finance are identified. Remittances from migrants to their home countries, which often contribute significantly to GDP. Increasing finance tailored to small and medium-sized enterprises, since they comprise the bulk of the private sector in many developing countries. A reform of the global financial architecture, for instance, as proposed by the Bridgetown Initiative, holds vast potentials to support developing countries in boosting their resilience against future climate shocks. And implementation of Article 21C of the Paris Agreement on making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low carbon and climate resilient development. As a result of the decision made at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh to establish a fund and funding arrangements for loss and damage, this year's report also specifically focuses on loss and damage to support parties in the negotiations. A recent study indicates that the 55 most climate vulnerable economies alone have already experienced losses and damages of more than $500 billion in the last 2 decades. These costs will rise steeply in the coming decades, particularly in the absence of strong mitigation and adaptation, which are by far the best ways to limit losses and damages. As the figure shows, the report identifies multiple ways of addressing the residual risks before, during, and after climate change events, and including economic and non-economic loss and damage. But many uncertainties remain regarding the financial needs to address loss and damage, and this requires urgent attention. While the new Loss and Damage Fund and funding arrangements will be important to mobilize resources, other innovative funding sources must be found to reach the necessary scale. In conclusion, despite clear signs of rising climate impacts worldwide, adaptation is slowing when it should be accelerating. First, the adaptation finance gap is widening and is much greater than previously estimated. Second, progress in adaptation planning and implementation is plateauing rather than showing the urgently needed acceleration. And third, without strong investment in mitigation and adaptation action worldwide, losses and damages will rise steeply in the coming decades, particularly for the most vulnerable. This will also constrain the next generations from shaping a livable future. COP28 must be the moment the world commits fully to insulating low-income countries and disadvantaged groups such as women and indigenous peoples from climate impacts. In the name of the authors, the steering committee, and the production team, I thank you for your attention. And I'll stop
Thank you very much, Henry. Much appreciated. Next, we will hear from Ms. Inge Anderson, who is the Executive Director of UNEP. Over to you, Ms. Anderson.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon from Nairobi. My thanks very much to the members of the press for covering this launch of the 2023 edition of the Adaptation Gap Report, and of course to my fellow panelists, and of course very much to the authors. I think the title really here says it all: underfinanced and underprepared. We are inadequately investing and planning on climate adaptation, and that leaves the world exposed. In a sense, the world is sleeping on adaptation, even when the wake-up call that nature has been sending us is becoming ever more shrill. This year, we saw temperature records again being broken. Again, we saw more floods, more heat waves, more droughts, more wildfires, a poor misery upon very vulnerable communities. The international communities should be throwing billions of dollars at helping developing nations to adapt to these impacts, but it isn't. This report tells us that the difference between the climate adaptation finance needs of developing countries and international public finance flow is over 50% higher than previous estimates. And that puts the adaptation finance gap in the range that we just heard from my colleague Henry at between 194 to 366 billion per year. And we know that without sufficient financing, implementation of adaptation actions will be stalling. The consequences are being lived right now by hundreds of millions of people, homes being washed away, crops failing, and livestock dying. There is a clear moral imperative to protect the people least responsible for the climate crisis, including the ability of coming generations to shape a livable future. And the report makes a clear economic case for investing in adaptation. And failure to invest in adaptation now will come back to haunt wealthier nations later, as they will be asked to face up to their responsibility for growing losses and damages. Even if the promise that we made together in Glasgow in 2021 to double adaptation finance support to 40 billion per year by 2025, even if that were to be met, that doesn't look likely, the finance gap would fall by only 5 to 10%. So we need to deliver more finance by strengthening international public flow, yes, but also by finding smart ways that the private sector can engage. And we need to reform the global financial architecture. And these are amongst some of the routes highlighted in the report. The visionary climate scientist Salim al-Haq, who tragically passed away just last week. We all know that Salim was instrumental in pushing the issues on adaptation and loss and damage higher up the climate negotiation agenda. As he put it, and I quote, "Every day, every week, every month, and every year from now on, within our lifetimes, things are going to get worse, and not a single country in the world is prepared," unquote. Salim and others like him have been warning us for years that climate disruption will be with us for decades and that we must get ready. So at the climate talks in Dubai now coming up at COP28, the world has to agree on how to deliver the necessary finance to protect low-income vulnerable countries and other disadvantaged groups. The alternative will be more misery, more disruption, and far larger invoices payable from developing nations in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Anderson. Next, we will hear from Mr. Ibrahim Tiao, who is the Executive Secretary of the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. Over to you, Mr. Tiao.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all from Bonn. And first, I would like to thank UNEP for inviting me to join this event, and to thank them very much for consistently putting to the world issues like adaptation. This is the 8th edition of the Adaptation Gap Report, but also mitigation, because they also have a specific report on mitigation. The title of this report is actually quite interesting: Underfinanced, Underprepared. I would actually stress more the underprepared, because even if we had finance, I'm not sure the world will be ready to actually deploy itself to duly take into account all the issues related to adaptation. From the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, we have two areas that are of interest to this discussion. One is land degradation and land loss, land which produces all the needs we have in the world in terms of food and quality of water and even part of the air we breathe. But we also deal with issues like droughts. On land, the just released report from last week from the UNCCD says that we lose up to 100 million hectares of land are degraded every year. So this is twice, or maybe the size of my own country, Mauritania, which is 1 million square kilometers, being degraded every year from around the world. This is happening mostly in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Western Asia, in North Asia, and in Latin America and the Caribbean. So the entire world, Europe is affected, and as well as the United States. So it is therefore very important that when we talk about adaptation, we see adaptation as a global phenomenon, not only for developing countries, but for the world at large. The issue of finance, adaptation finance, is very interesting, and thank you, UNEP, also for putting these figures. And when you remember what was coming from the first adaptation gap report to the 8th adaptation report, and you compare, you do some analysis, you realize that we are digging deep into the situation of climate change and the consequences it has on humanity. Countries affected by land degradation and drought are usually the most affected countries, the most vulnerable countries, are of course the poorest countries on earth. And the most vulnerable communities are rural women, children, and farmers and pastoralists from around the world. They lose their income, they lose their capacity to feed their families and to provide them with the basic needs they have. And most of the time, people even die from this. I think it is time for humanity to wake up to this issue, because yes, we have been paying a lot of attention on mitigation, but until we have adaptation as a very clear area where we would finance, we would provide financing, we will not be able to address the issues of climate change in a more systematic way. I also would like to thank UNEP for putting their finger on other areas of financing, because public financing is important, but it will never be sufficient until we understand, as Inga Anderson just said, that there is a business case for adaptation. You do not only invest on adaptation because you are a human, you want to do good for humanity. You invest in it because you want to do good for your own business. Because unless companies dealing with agriculture, the agri-food system, unless institutions that are using natural capital are investing on the same capital to maintain and to sustain their production, we will not achieve. So it is not only for developing countries, it is actually for business at large. So it is important that we consider investing on adaptation as a business case for for our own sake. So it's investment. And I would conclude by this. Seeing that adaptation finance in the world is actually shrinking at a time where we are calling for a doubling of adaptation is actually quite remarkable. Climate change is hitting more and more, and climate finance, international climate finance is declining. So where are we going? And what impact it will have on the poorest communities, on the most vulnerable communities, and yet we think that we can achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I think we need to really think very seriously about not only doubling the adaptation finance, but actually investing more in convincing more the private sector to invest on adaptation for their own sake. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mr. Tiao. Our final speaker today is Ms. Loretta Heber-Girardet, who is the Chief of Risk, Knowledge Monitoring and Capacity Development for the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. I'll hand you the floor, Loretta.
Thank you very much, and greetings from Geneva, and thank you, Executive Director Anderson, for inviting the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction to be part of this important launch. And we do also extend our congratulations on the release of the new UNEP Adaptation Report. Although we must say that we really express also deep concern about the sobering revelations that it presents. In a world where the urgency to combat the climate crisis has never been more critical, the report actually unveils a disheartening truth, and that is that we are falling behind. Our endeavors to meet the 1.5 degree temperature target of the Paris Agreement require a significant escalation in mitigation efforts, but we find ourselves lagging, not only in mitigation, but also in adaptation, financing, and action. And this is leaving yawning gaps that continue to widen. The release of the Adaptation Gap Report follows closely on the heels of UNDRR's midterm review of the Sendai framework, which is the global blueprint aimed at reducing disaster risks. And our review also paints a disconcerting picture of our trajectory, revealing that we are also off course to limit disaster risk and to prevent the emergence of new ones. And it's vital to acknowledge that climate change stands as the foremost threat multiplier in exacerbating disaster risks. And we know that today, 90% of disasters in most countries are extreme weather and climate related, and this figure is growing. And it's very disheartening to note that those nations that have contributed the least to the climate crisis are bearing the brunt of its devastating consequences. We've witnessed the floods and dam bursts in Libya that obliterated Derma, and the flash floods in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda that claimed over 3,000 lives in May. But these are just two recent examples. Developing countries are in dire need of assistance, and it is our collective responsibility to act swiftly. Now, the Adaptation Gap Report emphasizes the significance of planning instruments, revealing that 5 out of 6 countries now possess at least one adaptation plan. At the same time, at least 127 countries have formulated disaster risk reduction strategies. And we recognize that we have a critical opportunity to adopt a comprehensive risk management approach, one that transcends the silos between climate, environment, and disaster agencies and leverages our limited resources to the fullest. The forthcoming COP28 represents a pivotal moment to reverse the distressing trends highlighted in this report. At COP28, UNDRR will champion climate justice for developing nations through a call for 3 core actions, in addition to accelerating mitigation and adaptation financing. And first is to operationalize the Loss and Damage Fund. We still have time to reach an agreement, and it really is our fervent hope that this progress will be made and announced at the COP. At the same time, it is also time to institutionalize the Santiago Network, which has been under discussion now for several years. It is a key mechanism for providing technical assistance to help developing countries avert, minimize, and address losses and damages. And finally, we are calling for accelerated support for the implementation of the UN Secretary General's Early Warnings for All initiative, which is aiming for universal early warning coverage. And we know that early warning systems are really amongst the most cost-effective disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation measures. They save lives, they minimize losses, and we need to invest more in these. We also wish to highlight the need to focus our collective efforts on early warning, but also DRR and adaptation, especially in countries facing conflict and crises. We need a concerted effort to mobilize resources to these countries. They are the least likely to receive climate finance, and that means that their populations are the ones that are most likely to be left behind. We extend our gratitude to UNEP for this report, which serves as a compelling call to action. And we do commend UNEP for its unwavering commitment to producing these annual adaptation gap reviews, especially today's report. As we approach COP28, let us remember that we are at an inflection point. We still have the opportunity to redirect our current destructive course, and we must double our efforts and seize this opportunity together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hiba Girardet. And thank you to O. Henry and all our panelists. I'll go straight into the Q&A now. We have a question from Leon Ledugu from the Nation Group in Kenya. And it says, what stands out in this report for East Africa? And how does this report help us prioritize those most impacted by the climate crisis? I think I'll ask Ms. Anderson to take this one to start with.
Well, thank you for that question. And sitting in East Africa, I think it's obviously something that we see before our very eyes. And I think as a journalist will know well, this country, Kenya, has suffered extreme drought over 4 years, and therefore seen costs go up. But this country has also stepped up in extraordinary ways, together with the African Union, to host the Africa Climate Summit, which was a big statement for the continent, a statement that we're equals, we're demanding, and we have needs, and we also have solutions. And I thought that was very powerful. Now, on the specifics, is clearly when a country such as Kenya, but others too, are hit by persistent climate-related impacts year on year, it drags on the budget. President Ruto quoted at the Climate Summit that prior to the drought, school feeding was about 1.5 million children in that area. After the drought, 3.5 million children school feeding. Where does that money come from? It comes out of the budget. That means that the budget, there will be less for other causes that the budget needs to be spent on. And so it is that issue that these climate costs, some of them are very dramatic and are seen when big typhoons or floodings or other sort of immediate events happen, but it's also the long, slow pain, such as what Kenya experienced when 1.5 million heads of cattle died. So the issue here is that these costs have a consequence for the national budget, for the individual citizen. And of course, therefore, we need to have resources available to countries to avail themselves on, precisely so that they can create greater resilience to the risks that will be ever more frequent in the future that comes. And this is what the report emphasizes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a question which I think is from Mr. Tiao, which is, what does the growing gap mean for countries already extremely vulnerable and experiencing impacts such as desertification?
Thank you. It means more children dying. It means more children affected by drought. You know, the impact of drought on children is long-term. It's not only food, it's also their mental health and severe consequences on their development. It means more families being disaggregated. It means more unwanted migration. It means ecosystems that are completely destroyed, and it means impacts on the economy. I think you are all aware that any year of drought in countries that are most affected is a year of economic downturn, because the economies of these countries are largely based on the primary sector. So unless we are able to actually have serious financing, serious investments on adaptation, it may be very difficult to ensure food security and peace and security in most countries in the world, because droughts also has consequences on our own security in terms of conflicts over access to land and water between farmers and pastoralists and migrants and so forth. So it means a lot in terms of impact on our economy, on our peace, on our security.
Many thanks, Mr. Tiao. We have a question from Will Worley at the New Humanitarian, which would be for Ms. Hiba Girardet. Can you talk more about the implications of adaptation finance, the adaptation finance gap for disaster risk reduction and humanitarian policy?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I think that maybe three things come to mind. First of all, it further emphasizes the need for scaling up financing for disaster prevention. And right now, of the entire humanitarian budget, where a lot of the DRR funding comes from, it only represents 4% of the overall portfolio that goes into actions that are designed to prevent the impact of disasters. So again, we are falling behind on adaptation. DRR has always been a poorly resourced area of work. And so the lack of financing that we see in adaptation is exactly what we're seeing in disaster risk reduction. And as climate impacts increase, and this we see every day through the increase in disasters, we need to also urgently call for additional funding and financing for DRR and adaptation. Additionally, it gives even greater impetus to fund and to finance the Early Warnings for All initiative. We know that this is extremely cost effective, and countries that have effective early warning systems are less likely to incur losses and damages from disaster events. And so we are issuing really an urgent call to countries to mobilize resources, internal and external, and to establish the early warning system. And maybe a third implication is that it really, again, highlights the need to see very clear and direct action on loss and damage. As I mentioned, there is an opportunity now with the Loss and Damage Fund, but also the Santiago Network. This is a mechanism that has been in the planning now for several years to catalyze technical assistance to countries. And there still isn't yet a decision on this. So I think there's also really a political imperative that has emerged from this report to make decisions and to take action now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Neil Kamal from the Times of India. At a time when developing countries are facing the catastrophic situation of heat-stressed times, especially the year 2023, presumed to be the hottest as Pakistan faced unprecedented floods in 2022, the financing is highly inadequate. How can countries cope with the situation? And could there be some hope from COP28? Perhaps I can ask Mr. Tiao and Ms. Anderson if they'd like to say something.
Thank you. The report is very clear about it. It is certainly a situation where we see more catastrophes unfolding before our eyes at the time where we are actually paying less attention to the issues. This is really what the report says. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but that's the way I read the report. And this is the reality of the world today. The reality is that developing countries, poor countries that are really having difficulties having a balanced budget, will have to divest from education, from infrastructure, health, to simply feed some of their people or to respond to major disasters and major catastrophes like the one that the journalist mentioned in Pakistan. But Malawi had the same case, and more and more disasters in the world. I think it was Madam Anderson who also mentioned the drought in Eastern Africa, Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, and other countries. So when there is no adequate financing to cover these basic needs, countries will have to divest the little resources they have to actually make sure that their people are just kept afloat, that they're not dying of hunger. In some cases, we know that droughts are really situations where food production is not possible anymore. What it does also indirectly, when we do not provide sufficient financing, we are actually, it's an encouragement to international migration, unwanted migration. What is left to a young Somali to do, or a young Haitian to do, or a young gentleman from Sahel, when there is nothing left, when there is no ecosystem to provide them, when there is no natural capital, there is no possibility of producing food for their family, what is left for them to do but to flee? So unless we provide financing and adequate financing to some parts of the world, we will not be able to have a regular migration system in the world today. What it does also, as I said earlier, is to fuel more conflicts. People are not fighting each other simply because they hate each other, or this tribe hates the other tribe. They fight because it's competition for survival. So it is important that we see the consequences on all of this, not only to countries that are most affected, but also to the international community at large. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson, did you want to add anything to that?
Merely just to add, so everything that Mr. Cheo has said, therefore means that this COP needs to place an emphasis on this and come with the answers. A lot of work has gone on, a lot of analysis is known. Now is the time to land the loss and damage fund and to augment the financing that is already available for resilience, risk management, etc. Because without it, we will be in dire straits. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have one for Henry here, also from Will Worley at the New Humanitarian. Is this the first time the Adaptation Gap Report has included a chapter on loss and damage? And could you speak to the significance for policy of including this chapter?
Thank you, Keja. Indeed, this is the first time we're talking about loss and damage in the Adaptation Gap Reports. And we're doing this, of course, because of the decisions made at COP27 to land a loss and damage fund and the funding arrangements, and to make progress on the Santiago network. So there is a connection between adaptation and loss and damage, because the absence of preparation leads to more losses and damages down the road. And the consequences of that have been explained very clearly by Mr. Tiao and others, that the costs of responding reactively are much, much higher than acting in preparation of climate impacts that we can expect and will happen in the future. So in that sense, there is a very clear connection between adaptation and loss and damage. And I think it's really important to make sure that this is not considered a zero-sum game, because the loss and damage article is under the adaptation framework, and therefore many times there is likelihood that the funding that is needed for adaptation might then be diverted for loss and damage, and vice versa. So it's important to state that loss and damage needs to have its own standing, and that this does not go at the expense of adaptation. Thanks.
Thank you, Henry. We have a question from Clara Barata from the newspaper Público in Portugal. Why are the adaptation finance needs of developing countries over 50% higher than the previous range estimate? And can you explain the reasons why adaptation efforts have plateaued when we see climate change effects becoming clearer? I think this is one for Paul Watkins, who authored the finance chapter of the report.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, so perhaps the answer to this is to explain how we estimate the adaptation finance gap, and then to explain the answer to that question. So the adaptation finance gap is the difference between what we need and what we have. So we look at the cost of adaptation in the report, and then we compare that to international public adaptation finance flows. So we've got two headlines. The first one is really that the costs of adaptation now are a lot higher than our previous estimates. So to give you an example, in 2016 in the AGR, we estimated the cost of adaptation at about $140 to $300 billion. We always report a central range. What we've done in this report is we've looked at new modeled analysis, we've looked at the estimates from NDCs and NAPs, and our numbers moved up very significantly. So it's moved from 140 to 300 to the number that Henry presented, which is $215 to $387 billion a year this decade for developing countries. Why have those numbers gone up? Well, it's a combination of things, really. It's partly that the literature is more negative now. We, on the basis of the IPCC 6 assessment report, anticipate higher impacts from climate change, even in the short term. And of course, higher impacts means we have to do more adaptation. But also, in terms of their submissions, countries are being more comprehensive and recognizing they need to cover more sectors, they need support in various areas. So the estimates we're getting from developing countries themselves have improved. And the second headline that also explains why our numbers have gone up is it relates to the finance. So how do the costs compare to the international public adaptation finance flows? I suppose quite sadly, what we found is that in going from 2020 to 2021, there was actually a decrease in international public adaptation finance. So it dropped from 25 billion in 2020 to 21 billion in 2021. That may be an individual blip, it may be a one-off year effect, but what that means is our estimates of the cost of adaptation are increasing, and at the same time the finance is at least plateauing or even decreasing, and so we have a widening adaptation finance gap.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I'm afraid we are flat out of time. I know we have a lot of questions left, but our panelists have a very tight schedule, so we have to let them go. I'd like to thank the members of the media for joining us and giving us your time and attention, and to our distinguished and amazing panelists for this exciting discussion. All the very best for COP. Let's hope that we get some good solutions to the adaptation gap. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good one.
Thank you.